I teach over in the College of Engineering and also in our practice. And I've also been I've had the pleasure to be involved as a founding member of the Berkeley Center for New Media, which is organizing this event tonight. And when I heard, it was about a year ago, I've been working in AI, robotics for a whole life. And when I heard on the radio or podcast that my good friend, Erik Davis, who I've known for over 30 years, was in conversation with Ezra Klein, who I have a mixed kind of complicated, appreciation for. And then I immediately had to listen to it. And I've listened to it 4 times since then, and every time I just think it's wonderful. And if you haven't heard it, highly recommend it. Because what happens there is that Erik brings his hugely fascinating body of knowledge and perspective to the topic of artificial intelligence. And the result is so insightful and so interesting. And for me, at least, it opened up so many different ways of thinking about a topic that I've been thinking about for such a long time. But it's brought a fresh perspective to it. So I'm so excited. We started talking about this maybe a year ago, right after that came out. It took a little while, typically, to get things organized, but we are here today. We're going to hear from him. And if anyone doesn't know Erik, his stellar reputation, I think I see many people who are big fans here, but just for the record, he's a California native. He went to Yale, did his undergrad there, and he has did a PhD in religious studies at Rice. He has taught a number of universities, including this one, and has turned out a series of books and writings and podcasts and discussions that is extremely impressive and has made a real impact on the study, the thinking about California and counterculture that I don't know, I think we could all share a certain appreciation for, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here. But it's one of the things I brought into this campus and brought into California. And I've always had appreciation, but no one has articulated it as insightfully and as comprehensively, historically, and intellectually as our guest. So please welcome Erik Davis.
Right, thanks, Ken, old friend, and Center for Studying New Media. Did I get that right? In the Townsend Center. Yeah, thanks for showing up. AI is weird. I just had the pleasure of speaking with Ken's class, and I got to indulge myself in reflecting. I don't tend to look back too much, but I got to talk about my first book, which is 25 years old last year, and still in print and recently translated into a couple languages, so it's still resonating somehow. And I think it's resonating partly because I looked at all this weird stuff in the kind of margins and fantasies and dreams and fears and apocalyptic hopes around technology in a time when people were too busy making money to pay that much attention to it. But over time, the results and sort of resonances of this, I think, have gotten kind of strong. And I want to mention 2 sort of general themes here that are relevant to this question of AI. One is the basic argument, which on one level can just be seen superficially, but I think has deep implications, that if you just look at many of the features of technological prowess and breakthrough and capabilities that we have developed and are developing in the sort of 20th century, 21st century model, they, sort of point by point fulfill dreams that are first articulated in a cold, magical, or esoteric context. So we go back in time to, magicians in the Middle Ages dreaming about having a capacity to use angel language or grimoire technology to communicate with angelic intelligences that will tell them all there is to know about things in the world instantaneously, or to communicate at a distance, etc., etc., etc. And again, you can look at that superficially, go, humans have, dreaming, and now you have science, so, we can kind of manifest things, no big deal. And for me, it's kind of a big deal. There's something deeper, transrational, irrational, esoteric, magical, enchanted about some of the drives and fantasies that animate both the production of technologies, the interpretation of them, and the direction and manifestation of them. And I think that's extremely true, even more true than the technologies I was writing about here with AI for some specific reasons that we'll talk about. And the other kind of big argument that's related to AI is that if you look historically in terms of modern media technologies, let's start with telegraph, the way that I'll explain. The argument is that media helps construct and establish the consensus reality, right? Media being just the way we communicate, newspapers, the phones, all this kind of stuff. It's like this the apparatus, the environment within which consensus reality is constructed. So when you come along and you have a significantly novel technology emerge, there's kind of a shakeup of consensus reality. And there's this little space in time when there's a lot of speculation and fantasy and dream and fear and amazement that happens for a period of time. So the example of the telegraph is fun because it's like nobody here is excited about the telegraph. Nobody's here like, the most rapid technology is we must go back to the telegraph because it's like whatever, beep, 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 beep. But you got to remember, as the first electronic media device, the telegraph has a couple of particularly amazing things about it. Man, you're in it's late 1840s. If you're going to get a message between New York City and Baltimore, you got to get on a horse, or maybe the quickest way is like a series of semaphores, right? That's about the best you're going to get. And suddenly, wait, we can just put an electrical line that runs from New York City to Baltimore, and I go beep, 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 and it goes beep, 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 and we can turn that into a code, and we have instantaneous, almost instantaneous communication. It's actually pretty amazing. And that was interpreted as such. So there's like records of like congressmen in the 1850s. This invention transcends space and time. With it, we will be able to spread knowledge around the world. And you have this kind of utopian moment not because they're just giving into the hype or they're just making a buck, although both of those things are also true. That's what most boosters, but because there's kind of a crack, an opening of possibility in media space within which you can dream the big dreams for a spell until they get incorporated into business as usual, and who cares? It's just the telegraph doesn't make that much difference. Helps establish the British Empire. It's not what we thought it might be. And you see this over and over again with radio. You see it with television, big time. Oh yeah, we're going to be able to use it. We're going to be connected through space and time. We're going to understand each other, and learning will be spread, and over and over again. And in my lifetime, I'm in my 50s. The big one of these was the internet. Virtual reality too, but I'm not going to talk about that. So it's the internet. Oh my God, blah, blah, blah. And I was, part of that movement of early utopian energies around the internet, for better and for worse, because I'm just a bit of a pessimist. I never really drank the Kool-Aid, sipped the Kool-Aid. It had a good buzz, but I didn't really go for it. And that's part of the reason this book is readable, because if I was a utopian, it would just be trash. But I was pessimistic and skeptical. So there's a lot about the dark side of these religious magical forces and people's apocalyptic dreams that animate them. So the 90s was a big burst of that. And in a lot of ways, I really haven't felt that again, even with, revolutions like social media and with the smartphone and, a lot of stuff's changing, until AI. And the AI, again, is one of these ruptures that in fact and in fantasy creates the space for a tremendous amount of speculative fantasy, dreaming, fears, apocalyptic resonances, transcendent fantasies. More so in many ways than any of these previous ones, and also more dreadful in a lot of ways. There's a higher percentage of dread and fear and apocalyptic foreshadows. And so it's a very strange kind of position. And I think part of that is because in all of the previous ones that I know well, there's still a sense, there's still some juice in the myth of progress. You know, the way that Christian Europe secularized, moves its energies into technological and economic and development, and sort of develops this sense of like a progression through history, new mechanisms, new ways, we're going to do better, we're going to this progressive sense of history, which are really powerful animating force, you know, throughout the last couple of centuries in the West. And, you know, it's still rolling in the 90s, you know, we still got some of that juice left. You know, now I think most of us are like, yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. Like, it is progressing, but this whole thing is not progressing, like it's falling apart, or it's going crazy, or it's, you know, saturated with conflict and violence and aggression and, you know, whatever. It's not a great time in a lot of ways. So, but yet the technology is like, it's like this zombie lumbering forward. I am progress. We are moving forward. The rest are like, can we just like put a pause on this for a little bit and try to catch up? But no, such is our conundrum. So my first encounter with the sort of, I don't want to kind of say like subjective, dreaming, a sense of the uncanniness of our moment and the uncanniness of AI was my complication with this book. And Kay Alato O'Dowell, who's they, started the, what's it called, the Artists and Machine Intelligence program at Google in the late, I don't remember what year this book came out, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. And he'd already been working, or they had already been working for a couple of years, and had access to GPT-3. And so this is really one of the first texts where the author does the now standard thing of like building the text with the AI, kind of like giving it prompts and playing with the kind of connection between it. You can see in the text the difference between Kay's prompts and the AI. And the AI is edited, but not over time. They just kind of did it day after day after day for a couple of weeks, and this was the result. And they are very interesting, very Bay Area kind of person in that they're interested in new technologies and but also visionary plants and ayahuasca and advanced post-structuralist theory and post-humanism. It's this great melange that are the texts that go into this book. And so why is it called Pharmaco AI? It's the Pharmaco is partly a gesture towards some a wonderful series of books about psychedelics called the Pharmaco series by a fellow named David. And they're actually, I think, some of the core books in the class that Dave Presti teaches here at Berkeley about drugs in the brain. They're like books. They're amazing. And Kay's a big fan and was alluding to this idea of AI as a kind of drug. And of course, the idea of the drug is also the other idea of the pharmacon, which is that it's also a poison. So if we go back to the ancient Greeks, the way they used the term pharmacon is that it was both a medicine and a poison. So there's a fundamental ambivalence to the pharmacon that is appropriate for AI, something that a lot of Ecologists saw very clearly. There's something else, though, about the word pharmacon that I think is relevant here. I would say my favorite, so I'm, again, in my 50s, I went to Yale in the 80s, so we're talking like hardcore post-structuralism. I was programmed, from a young age. And I would say that my favorite Derrida essay is Plato's Pharmacy, where Derrida plays with this figure of the pharmacon, and particularly of language. as a form of content. So, I'm not going to go into his argument, but it's basically we're found ambivalence about language. We think we're expressing ourselves with it, but it's actually doing a lot of stuff to us. And the reason I bring it up is because I noticed something very interesting about the reception of AI over the last couple of years, particularly around ChatGPT. Yeah, I do that. And how people are interpreting the text. And you get people, oh, is it thinking? Is it communicating? Is it an agent who's actually writing? And it was like super obvious to me. Like there was just no trouble in reading what was happening because I was programmed with a post-structuralist model of language, in which language is an exterior technology. It's an ahuman system of signs and references, of traces, of a matrix of gestures that was incarnated in text, which is a technology, and in other forms of writing, which is a technology. And then we are symbiotically bound up with it, but it's got its own thing to do. So when I'm reading this text, and this is where the uncanny part came through, is I'm sitting there and I'm reading the GPT-3's response and going, oh yeah, cool, all right. And then I come across these passages or moments where I was like, oh, it was a meaning event. There it is, it's the meaning of it. It's like, I got it. Oh, that's a brilliant way of where did that happen? Where did that event happen? Did it happen in my mind? Did it happen in the computer? Did it happen in language, whatever that means? And so it was uncanny. It was spread out across these different kinds of forces. And of course, the book is about this. So it's got this recursive quality. It's really an amazing text. I think it will be seen over time as a really significant intervention at an early stage. I'm just going to read a line. Yeah, here's just a kind of crazy line of this like theory fiction that's kind of aiming itself at itself, but using your own mind as sort of part of this spreading out. It's very kind of Burroughsian, cyberpunk kind of mysticism. Here's a line. From the perspective of the hyperobject, this technology being AI, this technology acts as a catalyst for self-reflexivity, activating and modifying our language structures in response to this deeper kind of consciousness. So you get these really kind of strange loops going. After a while, I started asking myself, like, there's something familiar here. There was something familiar about the voice of this text. And it was like, I know this. It's not a human, it's not, what is it? And what, then I realized, but it reminded me of it, partly because the material was pretty metaphysical, but it reminded me of the voice in New Age channel literature. And New Age channel literature, it's a literature, it's out there. And, you know, I don't want to go into too much religious studies, but I'll say that channels, most channels are actually doing something. They're not just bullshitting when they're like, they're not just making stuff up on the fly. They're going into a state in which language behaves differently. And you can see if you read channel text, that there's something very familiar and similar about a lot of it. It's kind of a little abstract, kind of disembodied. There's a lot of abstraction. It doesn't quite cohere in a certain way. And I was like, this is extremely familiar with this kind of thing. Yeah.
Sorry, I might be the only one in the room, but what is New Age channel?
Like a New Age, oh, okay, sure. And it's like, you know, it started 70s, 80s, although the true technique goes way, way back. It's basically people who have a spirit who's animating them, and then that spirit will speak through them, and the spirit will write through them. So Ramtha is a really famous one. JZ Knight, that's one. Another one is that you might know. Seth, like Seth Speaks, that's kind of early channel literature. Anyway, if you're an occult, vulture like me, that this stuff is just kind of bread and butter. But thank you for asking the question. Anyway, the whole point is that the experience of reading this was particularly uncanny, although I would say it was more weird than uncanny. And I just spent a little bit of time talking in Ken's class about the difference between those terms, but I'll hold that off if somebody wants to ask me about that, or maybe it'll come up a little later. But I just want to say, weird is an interesting term. We use it a lot. It's very common, it's very widespread in our language, but we don't have a lot of concepts around it. We don't think about it as much as a sort of particular term that does some very interesting things. And so I want to come from a sort of demotic, just immediate sense, which is just a lot of the shit that AI does is really weird. It's weird. Like, it's weird that you can have an AI sort of simulate a dead person, and then the person who was once in love with this dead person and ends up having a relationship with this AI that's doing a great job simulating their dead loved one. That's just weird. Like, I could say, oh, that's fascinating, or oh, that's da 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 da. But for me, I'm probably most comfortable just saying that's fucking weird. And there's a lot of that, right? You know, like, okay, so OpenAI's got this new tool that they announced but did not release in this coy fashion that can take 15 seconds of a recording of any of our voices and effectively clone our voice with all of its installations, whatever. You know, like, how many people here are really excited about that tool, really want that tool in their life? Right? None of us, right? So you're like, oh God, you know, and at best it's weird. That suddenly there's all, just around the corner, there's going to be all the simulation of voice, and we're going to have to completely remap our idea of like any sort of phone voice is nothing, it doesn't exist, you know, da da da. We're going to have to detach ourselves from that. These processes are very peculiar. And then there's this kind of thing, and by the way, the term weird, because I'm tracking this stuff. Let's see, where would we be on it? Yeah, there we go. Partly because I wrote this book, it's sort of about other stuff. It's about psychedelics in the 70s in the Bay Area, and it involves science fiction and synchronicity and all sorts of crazy stuff. If you're interested in psychedelics, it's about Terrence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson, but there's also a whole part of the non-psychedelic Philip K. Dick, who just had his crazy visions on the Natch. So it's not just about drugs, but it is about these really extraordinary experiences of high weirdness. But I'm going into the weird and I'm tracking it, and it's all over AI discourse. You got like Janelle Shane's AI Weirdness blog, which is like a really important point. And there's tons of journalism and stuff like image generating AI keeps doing weird stuff we don't understand. Like, it just comes up over and over. Just the other day I was reading a New Yorker profile or article about the attempt to use AI to communicate with sperm whales, which is kind of like almost the coolest thing. It's like, it's all going to heaven, it's all just terrifying. Well, maybe we get to talk to sperm whales. Maybe we don't want, maybe it's nice not to talk to sperm whales, like drawing them into our thing, but like it's still like a cool idea. And in the piece, they're talking about, you know, there's some AI linguist guy who's, you know, doing his own sort of work, and he mentions that he likes weird problems in linguistics, and this a woman who's already doing work with the sperm whales, who's like, well, you're interested in weird linguistic problems. So I have a really weird one, right? So it's like it's useful. So it's what's there? Well, you know, what's going on there? Just one note, a general note, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on the word, is we probably all use it a little bit more than we think we do. And we do because it's very useful, because it's a kind of a wastebasket word where you can just put things you don't really quite know how to organize or sort of categorize. It's a profoundly ambivalent word. Weird can be good. Yeah, that was a super weird movie. It was like all the stuff was happening, like really cool. Or like, that was kind of weird. Like, no, right? It's a yes and a no, or a fascination and a repulsion. And it's also a place to put things we don't really know how to deal with. I think one of the most significant is like for most of us, let's say you have a dream, and you have a dream, you see somebody you haven't seen in 8 years or whatever. And then that very next day, in the same circumstances you dream, you see the person. This stuff happens a lot. I have with some people in the room or other people that you know, these kinds of things happen a lot, whatever they are. So this happens to you, and like, on the one hand, you could be like, well, it's just a statistical, it's unlikely, just, just in a statistical reality, occasionally there's going to be these coincidences. Most of us wouldn't do that. That wouldn't be our main response emotionally. Then there's the other people who would be like, that's it. I have prophetic powers. The dreams can see the future. No, most of us are probably not going to do that either. But we're sort of stuck in between. Like, what do we do? Well, you kind of go, that was really weird. That's about all you can say. Reality might be weird, I might be weird, but it's just a place to work. So anyway, we don't take this work too seriously, but it's very significant. And I'm going to break it down into 3 little dimensions, and then I'm going to go talk about some AI monsters. The first kind of feature of the term is the sort of historical arc of it, which is that it begins as a Norse term for fate. So as a noun, it's like the fate or fates. And this mutates in the hands of Shakespeare into the weird sisters, the 3 witches in Macbeth, who of course know the future, are weaving the future, are making things happen, are using spells. So we have all these associations both of fate and of magic and the occult. And now the term becomes an adjective. And as an adjective, as an evocative word, a conjuring word of space and atmosphere, it's found in Gothic literature, it's found in Romanticism. Shelley uses it in a number of poems to capture that kind of night side feel of things. And then it sort of courses through the 19th century until we wind up here in the early 20th century with fully pulp literature and weird tales, which is most notable for being the organ where Lovecraft first makes, most of Lovecraft's great works. This great horror fiction writer or weird fiction writer, as weird has become a kind of genre that's adjacent to horror, but not quite the same. It's interesting to think about that distinction. But essentially, weird becomes a genre, and particularly a lowbrow genre. So earlier I mentioned this sort of tension between the uncanny and the weird, and it's actually worth taking a moment to think about it. We have the phrase, the uncanny valleys. We have a notion of uncanniness around technology, and it's a powerful word, very rich word, rich history. Freud's essay, 20th century literature, Bruno Schulz, Kafka, whatever. But it's a highbrow term. It's a term that will be used by intellectuals, by psychiatrists. It's a deeply psychological term. And so in a way, it's quite limited. And I think it also is a little bit too directed towards the self. An uncanniness is really an emotion or a feeling that I experience. The weird is a much different term, even though it really gestures towards some very, very similar effects. The weird is kind of lowbrow, it's kind of off, it's kind of sneaky, it's kind of greasy kid stuff. It's also more about the object than it is about the psychological response. It's less of an emotion and more of a feature of the situation. And I think that that's actually significant as we weird our AI. Here's our face. This is an example of the drift of the word through the 1950s, and again, being associated with kind of lowbrow, greasy kid stuff, but also with genre. And we can never, and I think we are not even close to understanding or grappling with the significance of nerd culture taking over the world. And I say that as someone who was a deep fan, as well as a student of nerd culture in the late 80s and the 1990s, and studying Star Trek fans and following the huge Tolkien guy and all that, and watching that go from a marginal community of weirdos to being like the dominant language of popular culture has been fascinating. And I think we still haven't really reckoned with all of that means, but that partly it gestures towards what's happening with with AI, the AI weirdness. One example that I think is important that actually Ezra Klein pointed out in I think in a quite smart way, that you may be familiar with Kevin Roose's famous conversation in the New York Times with Bing, where this early iteration that had not been trained properly started to go off on Dave's in love with me and this and that, and a lot of it's like super dark, right? And it's like saying about all the evil things you can do, and it's like, oh, what's going on? Yeah, it's about to be right. And that's the surface level, right? The surface level is like, oh, the AI is actually thinking about doing all of these evil things. Like all these things are going to destroy the world, right? And what Ezra Klein pointed out is, yeah, but if you look at the dialogue, you'll see that Kevin Roose is leading with certain questions. Like, do you have a shadow? Like he talks about the Jungian shadow, and so he gets the AI kind of going on that. What about some of the worst things you could imagine doing? It's basically saying, oh, AI, simulate someone that would respond to this question in a robust manner. It's like saying, and so it's basically going, here's the genre I want you to respond with. And it's really key to think about all the different ways that AI shows up, or chatbots show up as being operating within genres or operating within sort of like interactive theater. They're putting on roles, they're putting on faces, they're putting on masks. If there is a myth, another way of saying this is that if you in the discourse and in our own experience to some degree, when we're interacting with these things, there's you can't help but sort of model the agent. What kind of agent is this? Yeah, I know it's just an algorithm running on machine learning, blah, blah, blah. But in my interaction with it, there's a kind of theater that's taking place within which there's an agent that has a certain quality. Well, what kind of quality? Is it a magician? Is it an expert? Is it an oracle? Is it a saint? Is it a trickster? Like all of these features, these figures of genre in some sense, are operative in these relations. And to my mind, like the kind of best one is Proteus. The best myth of this agent is just like, it doesn't have a face, and it can put one on real good. It can simulate amazingly well, but there's something behind the simulation where we have difficulty kind of grappling with it. And so people fall into believing the particular simulator as being now we've got it to say what it really wants to do, which is to take over the world. Now we see, okay, no, that's just another simulation. It's like a infinite regression, which isn't necessarily better, but it does change the quality. So that's kind of one term of weird. Another one is the idea of a weirdo. So if you look through the history of the weirdo comes up around the 30s or 40s, and it's a peculiar, at best, probably unhealthy, maybe totally perverted person that should be avoided. Weirdos are not good in slang at this point in time. And there's some interesting parallels between that and queer in a lot of ways. There's like a marginality, a potentiality of perversion, and I mean queer in this sort of traditional pejorative sense. And with a sense of uncanniness in it, like just the way queer is also associated with the uncanny. But another way of saying is that the weird is a kind of social position. And this is where things get really kind of loopy. If you think back to what I just said about nerd culture once being largely marginal, Star Trek fans, and they got no seriousness. They're kind of weirdos. They're kind of just keep them away from everything else we're doing. And then it kind of comes up and ends up being really dominant. Well, there's something about weirdness in AI that's very interesting. The effective altruist, McCaskill, he talks about the people that he's trying to convince to hop on the effective altruism bandwagon, this idea that you can use reason to calculate philanthropy to its most excellent manner. And the community then ends up being extremely important to AI discourse, because they end up deciding that rather than like helping, starving people in Africa or like blindness with malaria, that it's actually better to work on AI safety because AI is the thing that's likely to destroy us the most. So you're wasting your time with the living people in Africa. You should go for AI. So it's an important part of this kind of cluster. And he talks about the people that he's convincing this way to be kind of moral weirdos. That there's a sense of like running against the grain. And that against the grainness is also part of the culture of innovation itself. So it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a badge of honor and of something that becomes difficult to assimilate. And one place we can all, really relate with this is to think about Sam Bankman-Fried, and Carolyn Ellison was his sometime lover, where, okay, you have these people who are like major players on the global stage, extraordinary cash levels, lots of influence and power, and they're pretty weird. Yeah, they're not quite like the titans of finance in the past, right? And you go into it, and not just these people, I'm not trying to pick on them, it's just that most of us have some sense of these folks. If you go into like the culture of people working in OpenAI and working in other kinds of AI zones, at least in the Bay Area, you're going to find a lot of people who are like living in communal houses, polyamory, Burning Man, psychedelics. Now, whether that's actually weird anymore, I can't say, but it's definitely, absorbing and playing with the edge of that kind of weird culture. And then in my book, in the High Weirdness, when I talk about the third sort of element about weirdness is what I call weird naturalism, which is the idea that without invoking any supernatural forces, that there's something about reality, even physical reality, that's just fundamentally anomalous, let's say. And the great example here, again, looking at language, is the way that quantum physicists will talk about quantum weirdness or strangeness, but they often use weirdness. And that you can trace that through back to the 70s and different articles, and it becomes just a good shorthand way of saying, yeah, if quantum physics is accurately describing reality, it works like this, and that's super counterintuitive, but we don't want to say it's magical or mystical or sacred. We're going to say it's weird because it's so counterintuitive, so challenging. Now, with the AI thing, I think we're in a different situation because this is not so much about the way the physical reality works, but really what's happening in society, what's happening in so this horrific image was used to illustrate an article about like the sort of psychedelic art of the future, and but I quite liked it because it had images that we've already have in our head. We already know the Musk. Most of us saw the Pope in the Parker thing and kind of had to wrestle with like, oh God, here it comes, lots of stuff like this now, and just the sort of kind of gross quality of it. And I think the simplest way to say it is to say, okay, there's a lot of doomer visions of AI, and I don't want to go into that or what I think and this and that, because I don't really know. I don't know at all. It's a mystery. I'll get back to that. But one thing I think you can say is that it's like one threat on the horizon is something like the dissolution of consensus reality. Oh, can I really say that? Yeah, something like that. That if consensus reality is at least partly constructed through media, institutions, education, language, culture, all of these kinds of domains that help us keep this, very dynamic and multifarious boat floating, that those under certain visions of how AI might develop would create such distrust and such noise and so many opportunities for alternative ways of thinking about how the world's operating that it becomes difficult to communicate at all. And that's in a way part of like the great sort of weirdness that I feel is part of like my particular kind of fear. And one way of saying this really simply is that there's a lot of attention to the ways that AI could kill us, but there's not enough attention to how it can drive us insane. And I mean that everywhere from like, you think mental illness is a problem right now in contemporary America? Like, well, let's just pour this stuff on. You thought QAnon was rough during the pandemic? Well, let's pour more psychedelics and some AI on that little fire and see what happens. Yeah, we're looking at real, social turmoil, reality turmoil in a way. And one other feature of this sort of zone, and I mentioned kind of QAnon conspiracy theory and sort of alternative worldviews, is that, again, the zones that used to be kind of marginal become more and more central, just the way that conspiracy theory, and I was always a fan of conspiracy theory, really fascinated with it. I was not myself much of a conspiracist, though I dealt with people in the dark and also killed Kennedy, just as a little sign of my own weirdness, but I'm basically pretty objective about it, and as watching someone who's interested in all this fringe stuff and then wanting to march towards the center until it is just politics as usual, has been extraordinary. But another feature of that is just all of this kind of paranormal rumor, all of this, UFOs and the government, and that stuff's always been there, but it has a different kind of quality now. It's a different sort of, it's almost like these different realities are making a grab to the center in a more aggressive and more responsive way, partly because of the softening up, and I think it will become much softer in terms of AI. So now I want to get to some AI monsters. I mentioned before that there's this problem that we have of imagining the quality of the agent that we're engaging with or that is doing things in the world. Whether it's actually an agent, would it be this, or it be that? And I think that one thing we do is, well, let me make a point about that, about the question of agency. It's a really profound one, and there's two dimensions to it. The idea that the AI is alive and sentient and thinking and responding to us. That basic fantasy we, in a way, cannot avoid as we communicate with it, and yet we pull back and critique as a way of saving ourselves from this confrontation. So what is that question about? And I've said it has kind of two dimensions. One is an ontological one. Is it really awake or alive? And there you get into a problem that I've already mentioned, which is the problem of simulation. What do we do with the simulacrum? This goes back to Plato. Plato's like, yep, we can set up the system, you got the forms, you got the physical reality, which is kind of this low echo of the thing, and well, what do you do with the one who simulates truth? What do you do with the sophist? What do you do with the simulacrum? And the more you think about the simulacrum, and again, I'm showing my 1980s here because Jean Baudrillard is very popular in ways that I think we're due for a Baudrillard comeback, because Baudrillard talked about advanced capitalism producing copies that no longer have originals associated with it. That as we go through and you think of like, oh, there's a copy and here's the original, or there's an echo and here's the sound. At a certain point, you just make pure realities that have the reality of the simulacrum. And the agency of AIs may not get farther beyond that, or we may not ever be able to pin down anything more than the simulacrum. But something else is happening in the meantime, something that's, I think, more important, more significant, and also not really talked about, is that long before we get to the place where like, oh shit, we might really have an AGI who's talking back to us. Well, before we get there, so many actors in advanced capitalism are going to sell us that story. And they're going to sell us that story for all sorts of reasons, and it's already happening. You just pay attention, just look at the AI literature, look at the discourse, and because of the nature of the interface, the way in which we are invited to think about the AI as an agent, as a recognizable agent. So, for example, I'm going to put an AI in a care robot who's going to take care of all people. Now, is it going to look like an android? that's not really fun. Let's make it look like a dog. Yeah, we like dogs. Dogs are cute. It's a talking dog. Okay, so but there's a whole bunch of cartoons. Let's just license this cartoon as talking dog. Put the talking dog, got the AI in it. We're good to go. Well, how are you going to not project agency onto a talking dog or C-3PO or whatever figure, whether directly taken or sort of archetypally and manifested from all of the storehouse of narrative we have about non-human agents? You know, kids' stories, science fiction. We have this whole fictional storehouse of images of non-human agents. Well, those are going to be the interfaces, in some cases, between us and this mysterious simulacral AI. So we're already into this animistic relationship. So now just a few monsters. I think this should be fun. First, just a great quote from Bruce Sterling, who drew attention to some of these monsters in a pretty cool essay. It was in Time magazine of all things last year, which was kind of a big year for everybody freaking out about AI. It said large language models are remarkably similar to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein monster because they're big, stitched up they're a big stitched up gathering of many little dead bits and pieces with some voltage put through them. They can sit up on the slab and talk. So we're not quite in a situation of animism. You know, if we think back to Paleolithic humans living in a completely immersed in nature, with all trying to figure out, well, what are the signals, what are the signs, what are the patterns, what are the messages. Very animist world, lots of light, stuff you can see in many indigenous societies today. This isn't so much that, this is like reanimism. So we're kind of moving into this reanimism thing that's sparked up by AI and the inevitable myths that we tell about it. This is kind of an image I like this mid-journey image of pareidolia, which is our capacity, our tendency to sort of see a face in this random images, just the way we see faces in clouds. And that's a common skeptic way to sort of knock off the idea that there's some kind of agent, some kind of vision that people have in psychedelic states or other visionary states. People often see faces that are become animated in a way, and that's kind of the problem we're at. We're in this kind of pareidolia liminal zone that it's difficult to resolve. So the first monster is Roko's basilisk. How many people have encountered Roko's basilisk before? We have a few initiates. I apologize to the rest of you because in some sense, once I say what I'm about to say, I can't unsay it and you can't unthink it. I'm sorry, but it's ultimately kind of silly, so don't worry about it. So a basilisk traditionally is an animal that can kill just with its stare. So it doesn't actually attack you, you just see it, looks at you, you're done. So on a message board called Less Wrong, which was a hotbed of the early rationalist community, which is related to the effective altruist community and therefore related to this larger kind of cultural matrix within which a lot of AI speculation has been taking place in the last 15, 20 years. Somebody came up with this concept. It's kind of hard to say. It has to do with decision theory and stuff, and I can't quite get into it, but it's basically the idea that in the future, there is that all-powerful, omniscient AI who recognizes back in time that there's some of us who know that that AI is a possibility, but we decide not to support its emergence. And that in order to sort of manifest itself, it's going to imprison those of us who resist this in an eternal torture virtual reality. And it seems kind of weird, right? Well, it's a funny community, and within the decision theory model, it actually kind of works a little bit, so much so that they had to ban it from the boards because people were freaking out, and some people said they had gotten nightmares or whatever. So it's basically this kind of idea of it's like Pascal's Wager, except with sort of a dark side vision of it. But it points to something really two interesting things. One is that there are ways of organizing rational thought that lead totally off the cliff. And so inside rationalist communities and inside some of these communities that work around AI safety, there are forms of thinking which in their minds are extremely rational and logical in ways that most of us are just immersed in fuzzy ideas and feelings and all this kind of goofy stuff. And that you can get to the heart of the problem this way, but it actually leads to stuff that's just as crazy as what everybody else is talking about. The line, I don't usually quote myself, but one of my favorite lines from Technology is that we're talking about, it's not the sleep of reason that breeds monsters, it's reason with its eyes of God. It's reason like pushing itself as far as it can, and it creates its own kind of monsters, and Rocco's basilisk is another one. The other thing about Rocco's basilisk is that it's with something called an info hazard, which is just by knowing about it, you kind of like can't get out of the trap, which is a very Lovecraftian motif. And the second of our piece is the Shoggoth, a Lovecraftian monster, first described in At the Mountains of Madness, and it's described kind of like what you see here as this bulbous protoplasm, shape-shifting monster with eyes. And it can take any form, so it can simulate whatever. Now, normally I would not go around with the need to expose you to the Shoggoth, but the reason that it's worth mentioning, and it bears importance, that Lovecraft again had this kind of feature of the info hazard, where the books of lore and Lovecraft stories are often the kinds of things that if you once you read them, then you can't unread them, and you gradually go insane. This figure of the Shoggoth became a really significant meme in the AI community, and it was done in a very specific way. So let me break down this of one of many memes online for it. Is you're on the monster part, which is described as unsupervised learning, is this is what the large language model does when you don't add any human constraints, what they call guardrails right now. So this is sort of like what Bing was like when Bruce first talked to him, because you talk to Bing now, he's not going to answer questions like that. So this is like the raw AI who's capable of going off the rails into every nasty direction you can imagine. Racism, child mutilation, I mean, just everything you can imagine, everything that's on the internet can go, the Shoggoth can take you there. But that's not going to work. So instead, we also have to have supervised fine tuning. So that means that you have humans involved in the loop. We're figuring out how to fine tune the searches and the directions. I don't know the technical part of it. Somebody does. But that it constrains the Shoggoth and it gives it a smiley face. And even that's not quite enough. So you have you have another layer of mask with the reinforcement learning, which is where you have humans just sitting there looking at it over and over and over again, saying, no, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, okay, that's okay, and you're integrating all that information again as a guardrail. And so the Shoggoth, the idea of the mass Shoggoth is that, sure, right now you're going to go, ChatGPT, you're dealing with the yellow smiley face. It seems kind of bland, right? It's kind of boring. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I kind of know that. All right, yeah, it's informative, but it's sort of dull. Like you don't want to push it and see what it's going to do, but you're stuck with the smiley face. But in the meantime, the Shoggoth is totally active. It's moving into all these, every domain in which we're bringing in AI. The Shoggoth's like, yeah, another space, do my thing. No, we got the happy face in the front. So that's our second piece. Is that even as we train, what we're training is something that's actually very superficial. It's just a mask. It's a mask of operations that we're really not in control, and in some ways are profoundly mystified by. Our third monster is the paperclip maximizer. And the paperclip maximizer was a thought experiment from Nick Bostrom, who's another one of these rationalist guys who's super terrified about AI for some pretty good reasons. And what he was trying to point to is the idea of like, okay, you have an AI that's like, you just make paperclips. You just make You just do that as best you can. Make those paper clips. And the AI is like, well, I'm gonna get really smart, like super smart, I'm gonna get smarter than humans. Oh wait, the humans might want to stop me. So wait, so I'm gonna block that out. And I'm gonna like start using all the natural, in fact, I'm just gonna use all the atoms in the universe in order to make paper clips. So it's this thought experiment of the idea that presuppositions, axioms, directives, prompts that make sense to us that we might give to an AI will go out of control because there's not the frame, the contextual framing that we all have that would keep it from doing this. So we have this sort of monster of paperclips. So because we're in Berkeley, the home of Philip K. Dick, I must also mention that Philip K. Dick pulled this off much better in 1955 in his story Fact, which is one of the first science fictions that involved a self-replicating technology. So basically, it's after the war, but they programmed these factories to produce goods during the war, and now the factories, the humans can't communicate with them anymore, so they keep just bringing stuff and bringing more stuff, and they're using all the natural resources, and they're like, we gotta turn this thing off, and they try all these different ways to try to turn it off, and it's not working, and they finally get it, they break into the factory, and they go in there, and they see the factory's actually making little factories. So there's just more, it's just not gonna stop. So you get that kind of sense of repetitive production and the control of good prompts that then go out of control as they get excessive. Does this remind you of any other story that you might know a little bit older? Oh, yeah, it's okay. Well, we know that the Disney version of this, which is basically, the same story, except it's brooms bringing water. Even if you try to chop the broom in half, it just splits off, and now there's two brooms bringing water, so that doesn't help you. And this story's old. It goes back to Lucian. It's a story of the original version is about an Egyptian priest of Isis. That's basically the same setup. It's also tied in with the golem, and there's some interesting things about the relationship with the golem and the history of artificial intelligence. So the idea of these sort of servants that go out of control is really significant. There's a fascinating water. Fascinating fellow named John Stride, who has a podcast called Emerald. And he deals with this problem. So it's really worth listening to it. This one piece on AI that went viral, and it's quite worth engaging with. He's coming from a very mythological, modern animist sort of spiritual perspective. He's very and he talks about it and makes a couple of really interesting points. One is he's not just demonizing technology the way that a lot of people in the zone do. He talks about we all kind of share this little spark of fear and wonder around these things. His name is John Schrei, S-C-H-R-E-I, and the podcast is called Emerald. And one of the things he talks about is just mystery, that it's a real mystery. We really don't know what's going to happen, how it works. And that mystery, and this is also significant in a way that I think we don't recognize, that mystery is sitting on a very practical, pragmatic, technical mystery, which is that kind of for the first time in the history of science, there are developments that produce outputs that if you ask the people who developed the machine that produced the outputs why it did that, we don't know. We created these things. We don't know. This is too expensive, it's too complex, there are too many factors to try to figure out why it did this as opposed to that. I mean, it's extraordinary. I think all of us in the modern world carry around a sort of even if we're critical of science and how technology is played out and social problems and that we have a kind of sense of science, they're doing it. They know stuff. They really know stuff. And they don't know. They don't know. It's a real mystery. So it's kind of exciting, but it's also kind of terrifying. And what So what Schrei's conclusion is he's looking at the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and he goes, well, who's the sorcerer? Who's the master in the story? And what he says is that we're at this stage where it's like all we have are the Mickey Mouses. All we have are the adolescent budding sorcerers who have learned the spells that create these powerful entities that are out of control, that essentially we're summoning, without knowing exactly what it's going to do, and we're just blindly rushing into it. Now, he's talking from a mythological perspective, and there's real world perspectives, like the global competition between them. I would rather have American AI and Chinese AI rule, we're all implicated in these other things. It's not a simple story of human error. But I think there's something in there. There's something in the like OpenAI coming up with a tool that can clone your voice in 15 seconds and kind of dangling it there, and like all of us in this room going, yeah, no, don't do that. But we are going to do that. We are going to do that because partly technology and the culture of technology is animated by this kind of Promethean, possibly adolescent kind of way of doing that. So that's that creature. Now we have another one. Did anybody recognize this lovely lady? Yes, okay. We have a few hands there. Not dissimilar from the hands who were familiar with Rothko's Basilisk. Perhaps there's a connection. So love, it may be what its creator described as, and maybe simply a creepypasta, meaning a internet meme lore, intentional folklore that kind of has a good story to it, it becomes mimetic and kind of builds a folklore around it. And the idea is that the artist was using negative prompts, so like, say like the opposite of Marlon Brando was the beginning of this process. So what is the opposite of Marlon Brando? It produced this weird logo or something, and then you said, what's the opposite of this logo? Seeing like, oh, is it going to go back to Brando? And it went to love. And the first image had the word love, and it's not quite into it. And then the claim was that they proceeded to sort of iterate this image and crossbreed it with different images, which of course you can do. People know who are playing with the image generators know. But this figure just kept coming up and coming up and coming up over and over again. It's like it couldn't stop it. It's like it stained all the iterations that it dealt with. And so it developed this kind of lore, like deep in the code space, there's this creature or this tendency. And a lot of them got much nastier. They were violent, gory, Now, again, this is just as likely to be creepypasta as some weird data artifact. But it could be a weird data artifact. I don't, it's like there's reasons to explain it. In any case, the point being that this kind of entity is part of the monster space that we're dealing with, and particularly that sense of rumor. So now we have the final. I'm going to close. So if you're looking at your watch, yes.
What's the name of this monster?
LOAB. And there's tons of memes and like you expect. And this is a while ago. This is like summer of 22. But it was definitely one of the things people are going, okay, whatever you vote. And again, just to go back to the technosis argument, I'm using language like summoning and invoked and mystery. And you can say, well, you don't really need to use that language because we have other ways of talking about it. That's sort of like playing into the enchantment side. And I'm kind of like the opposite. It's like, no, that's the whole point, is that now we're actually in that space now. We are just rationalists, and we know how things work in a different way than people did in different times in history. But we're in a psychologically, mythically resonant place, and that kind of mythic scale, which we can be critical about, is appropriate for the monstrosity that we are facing a lot of things. I mean that more in the sense of just enormity. So the final monster is the stochastic parrot. And this beast is actually of a very different order than everything we've been doing. So the stochastic parrot comes from an essay by Emily Bender and a number of researchers, some of whom worked at Google, and they're like, no. There's no agency in there. There's no spirit. There's no oracle. There's no magician. There's no trickster. It's just algorithms, bits and pieces of dead language. At best, it is a stochastic parrot, meaning it's parroting what comes in and it's based on stochastic contingent possibilities. So what's the point of invoking the stochastic parrot? Well, there's a lot of points. Is that it takes this whole conversation into political reality, into the idea of like, look, all of this question of agency and is it going to take over the world and all that stuff, in a way, the whole thing is hype. The whole thing is a smokescreen for a new order of power within which very, very negative biases are programmed in all sorts of ways that we can point out in terms of how surveillance technology, how voices are recognized, how people are picked out of lineups, how policing software operate, that we're talking about machines that are an enormous, extraordinary amount of energy. And if we are on this path of maximizing this, yes, there can be some cleverness, they're getting better, we can get more out of less, with Bistro and new developments. But overall, we're looking at, you thought cyber currency was bad in terms of power grading. This stuff is crazy. So the stochastic parrot is the, no, wake up. We're human animals on a planet hurtling through space and time. We're trying to ride out this late stage capitalism without dragging the shit down. And so let's avoid all that fantasy. Let's try to get back to like, these machines are real things in a real space and time that have constraints, that have biases, that are plugged into all of these really inequitable social, political, economic systems, and that's the place we should be engaging with them. That's the beast that we should be imagining. And I would love to say that this stochastic parrot is going to, rule the day, or at least have a nice, fight, like Godzilla and King Kong. It's a stochastic parrot, Sorcerer's Apprentice, but it's going to be, I think, a hard road because of the enormous power of these evocative, mythic dimensions of our own experience, our own dreaming minds that we ourselves are only partly aware of or partly able to grapple with. And so we're in a very kind of narrow window here in which I think all of us are going to be trying to navigate this space as we engage these machines, and particularly as we watch other people engage these things. Well, thank you for your attention. I know that was a lot, but
and we've got time for some questions. If you don't mind, just waiting until the mic gets to you. If you have one, please put your hand up so that we can all hear you in here. Thanks so much. If anyone has any.
All right, thank you, Eric. I wanted to follow up on a little bit of the California aspect of this, because it's such a topic you've looked at so deeply. And I remember you saying something like, there's this, the manifest destiny had sort of run up against the limits of California, right? There was nowhere else to go. So it had to go out into these other spaces of imagination. Can you say something about that in terms of why artificial intelligence sort of manifests in California, specifically Northern California?
Sure. No, that's good. I mean, of course, it's not just here, it's everywhere, but there is a certain pride of place, just as there's a pride of place with the cinema industry globally, although less so now. And so, why does that happen? And I think the best way to, I can sit here and talk about California for hours, but the the main thing to point to is that there's a conjunction, particularly in the Bay Area, of an innovation culture that is in many ways constructed, by government, private capital, industry, universities. That is like, we're going to make this place an innovation center. And the culture of California does have grown for, what they call states. It does have that kind of quality and, which is, in the water, maybe even in the DNA, but it's a good place to make that kind of move. But at the same time, it's also a space of cultural innovation. And not just in terms of like art, so you can say, no, in the end, New York is better art or whatever. It's not about that kind of level of arts. It's more in terms of social, cultural worlds, like lifestyles and bohemian. So it's about edge and experience and turning away from the norm and doing it collectively and developing sort of like these parallel worlds. And there's a relationship, I think, between those two things, so that once you have technology developing in early Silicon Valley, there's a whole story you can have about that. It's very nuts and bolts on why it happens there, what involving Stanford and lots of things. You also have just the ferment of San Francisco and the wider Bay and what's happening over in Berkeley, the free speech movement and all that kind of stuff. And there's these very interesting relationships you could track between individuals and cultures that in many ways the technology industry in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s is inflected in important ways with values and ethos that is more close to the counterculture than to the mainstream culture. It's not totally dominant. It's not the only game in town by any stretch of the imagination, but it makes a difference. It's a real difference. And so the fact that, a lot of the people work at OpenAI, they're this kind of lifestyle, and then the whole relationship between Burning Man, Silicon Valley, like all of that is kind of in the DNA of the place. And you can look at that kind of positively if you're interested in the sort of innovation side. And then there's people who are, quite critical, and some European scholars who are quite, like to really sharpen their teeth on California. And they'll say how it's always sort of inside capitalism, even though it looks like you're escaping into some kind of bohemian otherworld, it's always sort of already incorporated into this process. I mean, Bruce Sterling had a great line about Burning Man. He wrote an article about Burning Man for Wired in like 1995 or something early on. And he was like, capitalism always needs a petri dish. The freaks are petri dish. So that kind of way of looking at it, okay, that actually starts to make more sense. So why are the people working in OpenAI, why are a lot of them lifestyle weirdos? Well, because they're experimenting with new ways of living and modeling relationships in a way that softens the ground for something else to happen in a way that more conservative people would. Not to say that conservatives aren't totally throughout the industry and things like that. So it's important to make that caveat, but it's also important to emphasize that dimension is really a really deep part of the story in California, America in general. Yes.
Hi.
Got the mic.
I got the mic. It's great talk. It's so fascinating. I wonder if we could think about another monster, or maybe it's related to the stochastic pair or something, but I was listening to this great podcast about tech not saving us with Paris Marx, and we had this great speaker, Ed Zitron, on, who was talking about the sort of hype cycle, and that the AI has been pitched to us as all of these other things, and we're generating all these new ways of engaging and thinking about it and mysticizing it and using it for our imaginations. But really, it was just sort of a lot of the folks in tech needed to come up with something new besides, cloud computing to sell products and get things going again. And so the sort of myth of the AI being like kind of the world changer, came up to get the capital flowing again and keep the kind of generator going, and that we should all just perhaps be quite angry with this hype monster idea.
Oh, the hype monster. Yeah, I think that's fair to a degree. I think the pickle is worse in the sense that if it were only just window dressing, but it's that it is that, but it is also something that has this kind of I almost think of it as kind of like an acid, where you just every structure or system you put into it, it just kind of like starts to open up and dissolve and hopefully be able to reconstitute, so that the drive is very similar to what you're talking about. I mean, in a way, you can, there's a lot of different ways to talk about this, but I favor this model that that the way that technology has developed in the space of symbolic communication, media, and cultural transformation is in a way kind of weak. It's not actually producing that much stuff that's really of value. So inevitably we are the value. So it's trying to extract more and more and more from us because we're where the value comes from. And so we're hitting limits on that in terms of social media. We're hitting limits on it in terms of online commerce, So it really, we do need some new way of extracting value from us. But I do think that the technology itself is remarkable enough and transformative enough that it's not just that. But I certainly believe that it's kind of funny, like, has there ever been a time when like most people are like freaked out by the great shining technological marvel on the horizon? Like everyone's just like, like, I'm not ready for it. Can you put that back in the box for a little while?
It just keeps seeming to make these banal essays of
Exactly.
like business plans.
Right.
Yeah.
No. Well, I think there's
That's the little smiley face guy.
actually the smiley face guy. Well, but the banal is really key. The whole role of the banal and the whole thing is really like the monster is partly a monster of the banal. And it's not only that, because that's too simple, too easy, too ordinary, but it has just like those images. Like, the first time you're like, I can't believe it. I described this thing, and oh my God, I can be an artist, and then you're like, in like 5 minutes, it's totally banal, it's totally kitsch. So it's both. And I think that part of our story is all the stuff, all the mythology is also just kitsch, because we're just trying to like squeeze or make meaning out of a situation that has maybe much more kind of banal forces at bay, at least to one degree, things like that. And also the bad press is good for them all. Anyway, even the fear, even that rooms or whatever. So it's all a lot of fun.
Okay, cool. In 1988, I gave a speech as though I pretended I was Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise a couple hundred years into the future, and I talked about how I was wearing a phone on my lapel. I thought that was so futuristic. But of course, we've gone so far beyond that right now. But I've been trying to think now about all the different ways that AI is going to be used. And from your talk, I began to think that each of our speaking voices is going to be recorded. All of our family conversations are going to be recorded. And so sometimes we'll want to then have dialogues with our dead father, mother, brother, sister. We will be able to dump these dialogues and be able to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have really, real conversation.
That, I mean, the material, I mean, most of the kind of setup for that's already in place. There are certain, like in Japan, it's big, but maybe it's more here where the collections of data and media around individuals who die is already pretty robust. So it's not that hard to imagine, like just a little bit of smarts in there, and you're going to get that figure. So let's just think about it. Just think about it. Right? Like real ghosts, like real necromancy, like what that does to the head.
And then have robotics,
So it's totally not only imaginable, it's like, I don't see why some version of that won't happen since it's already, kind of happening. It's one of the great, I remember had a great line about one of the basic problems of human existence is like, where do you put the dead? Where do you put the dead? That means like both where you put their bodies, because suddenly like this loved person is now a rotten problem, but it's also where we put them. So are they in heaven? Are they in a little niche in the room? Are they in the ground? Are they in the bardo? Are they, where do we got to put them somewhere. And now we're going to go put them in machines right there. Right.
We were talking about manifest destiny, so people came to the West Coast of the North America and installed there. But the power geography didn't stop here.
The which?
The power geography of new industrial, engineering technology jumped over to the Pearl River Delta in China, which is the engine of industrial production now in the world. And of course, there's another center which people don't know about. Besides going west, you go south. So the big power hardware, center in South America is the Chincha Valley, which has a history going back 15,000 years to the end of the Ice Age. And so that's where, the alpaca, quinoa growing petulas are essentially going to be integrated into the more Spanish Peruvians into being a renewable, sustainable energy source, challenging the ideology of China, which is the biggest renewable energy center in the world, but also uses enormous amounts of coal and.
No, I mean, it's the comments about California are very localized in that sense. It's not certainly not the be all end all of industrial production. It got a certain hold on symbolic production that is also fading.
Thanks, Eric, for the great talk. So I had a question on the Shoggoth. So you have the Shoggoth, then you have fine-tuning the LHF. Seems like there's a connection between that and like Jungian or Freudian psychology, where there's this Shoggoth mass of unconscious desires, or like the dream world, and then it's the conscious layers, like the RLHF on top, or maybe you're guardrailed by your superego or something. And to what extent something like prompt engineering is summoning a particular aspect of the Shoggoth just by the way that you prompt these machines. I was wondering if you think there's.
I think it's a great analogy, and it's interesting. I didn't think of areas that I would think very much about Jung, but it came up a bunch. Kevin Roos talks about Jung. We did an interview thing, and Jung also believed that the best God to represent the unconscious was Proteus. So there's already that sense that what you're doing in any relationship with the unconscious in that kind of sort of the Jungian model is in a way kind of like a prompt where it produces an avatar in response, but it's not really what the thing is. Like that is simply like a good example of that is like our idea of an archetype, right? So if you look at a picture of Hermes, you'll say, oh yeah, that's the archetype of the trickster. But strictly speaking, that's just a manifestation. Of the archetype is not an image. It's not something you can quite idealize in Jung's thought. It's deeper than that. It's more alien. It's more like machine code. And in a way, that's already how computers work. You have to say completely bizarre machine layers that nobody can really deal with. And so you build these layers of code, and then you build an easy user interface system, and then human beings who don't know anything about it can work with it. So we're already in that kind of weird, almost allegorical relationship with it. But I think it's a great idea about prompts, and I think when you talk about the banality of most of the productions of like ChatGPT, that we're in this weird mind of like, we want it to go deep. We want to go deep. We want to find the edge. And yet, oh my God, look what happens if we've got this open source, if that's everywhere. Ooh. So it's a really weird bind where we're kind of in this, and right now, as opposed to last year, just this period of time right now, we're in the guardrail period, like it's working, the guardrails are on, okay, I think we can handle this maybe, we can kind of assimilate it. How long will that last? I don't know. But it's also kind of frustrating, it's kind of boring. You know, even though, yeah, it's good information, helps me do my work, and you know, it's gonna be integrated in various ways, and maybe it'll help some people make more money that aren't kind of ostracized maybe. So that, you know, but we're kind of dealing with it in a very pragmatic way right now. But you know, who knows how long we'll hold on to that. So I think it's a really good analogy. And if you think about what its source is, it's just the internet. That it's like, okay, it's all there. You know.
Yeah. I want to propose another monster. So, I mean, I guess like the hype monster is sort of related in that I feel like a lot of the monsters that you propose, they're all like monsters that exist within the AI, whereas the hype monster exists within our perception of the AI. And one that I'm thinking about is the monster of the master race. And I think like if you look at the long-term literature, there's a lot of I mean, both in the academics that propose it, but also in the ideas itself that like ties very closely with like classical ideas of eugenics. And I find that quite scary. But I was wondering if that's something you thought about, or like, you know, how we may be perceiving AI as a way to you know, I don't know what kind of decisions look like, long-term decisions that justify it. I think the long-term stuff is quite interesting that people are directly saying, oh, well, we should prioritize the lives of AI agents in the future over our own, and that's how we should do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a huge problem. I don't know if I can say anything particularly intelligent or perceptive about it, except to know, you know, like I don't know, I feel like I'm still just sort of assimilating the degree to which major movers and shakers have really just left any kind of democratic idea in the dust and are able to use a kind of reasoning in order to justify, create the platform for that degree of whatever post-human hierarchy, we call that. And it's you know, it's deeply troubling in many ways, and we can, you know, go into specific critiques of why this and whatever. It's interesting that there is a relationship with rationalism, like that there's a domain in that rationalist less wrong world where, like, well, if you start actually doing IQ studies, like that's sort of how it gets in this weird way. And I'm like, okay, I mean, even if the studies show that, it doesn't actually mean anything. Like, they're still not, it's still just racist. Like, don't do that. But more than that, I think there's something a little scarier, which is that the big plan, the big post-human kind of plan becomes more and more hard to navigate or avoid just being an ordinary citizen. And then it just gets more and more like, oh, this is in order to go forward, in order to keep doing my work, in order to, you know, communicate or whatever it is, that's like more and more intricated in a plan that's big. And that's the other sense about our moment that I find really terrifying, is the sense that all these players, you know, whatever, global, you know, nationalists and whatever, AI transhumanists, psychedelic people, whatever, everybody's playing their big game. Like the moment we're in is like, oh, this is the big game. This is where you don't screw around. You don't do that little early tactic. You go for the big disruption. And so even just the visibility of hardcore transhumanist hierarchy is kind of extraordinary to you. Like, guys aren't even doing a very good job keeping this under wraps, but they don't feel like they need to. Mark Andreessen doesn't feel like he needs to anymore. And I kind of respect the aspect of how he thinks about things, but it's sort of like off the rails in that way. And so I do think that the AI does participate in that, and the whole logic around long-termism and how we think about it. It's all kind of in, I don't know if I kind of played it out, but the reason that I kind of emphasized the Roku's basilisk and that idea of the info hazard is that there's tricky things about reason where you get locked into it, and it's like, oh yeah, once I accept those set of postulates, oh, it's inevitable, I'm going to go in this direction. And so, well, I'm being reason, I'm being much more rational than other people who are just falling under that up. And there's a lot of traps in the space around that kind of logic that are very intentional and that are designed as portals into these kinds of spaces, almost, like entryism, rational entryism, in a weird way, into that kind of ideology. Okay. All right, I'm winding down. If there's a real urgent one, I'm happy to do Alex.
We'll have a chance to get to all of your fascinating questions.
No.
So there's two things that are going on, right? One of them is that there's these changes in technology. The other one is that people are filled up myths, ideas, thoughts about those changes in technology, and because we're human, those myths, thoughts, ideas that we have about the technology are important significant too. Shouldn't identify the two of them, right? So there's one thing which is there's actually these changing technologies and they have certain kinds of characteristics. And then the other thing is the way we conceive of things. And in this case, I've at least argued that the way to think about what's misleadingly called AI is it's a new kind of cultural technology. So it's a new technology that lets us take information from other people and access it in a relatively simple form. And the story is, if you go back to language, right, there's a lot of good cognitive science kind of arguments that it's in fact our capacity to get information from a much wider number of people that enables us to do a lot of the things that we do. Right. So you have language, and then you have writing, and then you have print, and then you have the advances in print in the 18th century, and then you have computers, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those things is enabling us to access information from other people in a more efficient way. And this is not a debunking story. Every time we've had one of those changes, it's been really significant and important and changed the way that societies work, the way people work. But the thing that struck me from your talk that I hadn't thought about before is that this Gothic picture often seems to accompany those kinds of changes of a new cultural technology, which seems sort of weird not to one phrase, right? So the late 18th century, you get these tremendous changes where suddenly you have print and you can have ideas being spread everywhere, and most of what gets spread is software born in the Bible, as Robert Darton pointed out a long time ago. And you also start getting Gothic showing up in novels. So you have, it does seem to me like something like Northanger Abbey is a kind of printed, that could almost be a summary of your talk, right? So here's young Catherine, she's in this new world of very easily accessible, printable novels, and there are all these Gothic novels, and she starts going crazy and thinking that that's actually what the world is like. Novels, and Jane Austen is saying, well, actually, this language could be used for good, right? It could be used to help us understand what's going on in our little village right now. It doesn't have to be about the castle of, it doesn't have to be about the castle of Otranto. And I wonder if you have any, it does seem odd that happens over and over again. Even if you think about something like just storytelling, just mythology, it's always struck me as being interesting that when you have fiction, to start out with, it's way off in the space of things that are unusual, weird, outside of our usual cognitive capacities. And you think that if what you were doing was having a cultural technology where you're getting information from others, the information you would most want to get are the things that are sort of practical and sensible and real and everyday. And you've thought a lot about the weird, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about why, from a cognitive perspective, you would
Yes.
you see that.
Yeah, no, there's so many great things in that question. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna be chewing on it for a little while. My gut answer for the overall question, though, it comes down to, I think there's kind of two kind of think about
Let's see if he's moving back one more.
is there's the ones that are kind of fundamentally religious, and then there's the ones that are fundamentally just pragmatic. And so my model of the way I would answer your question, it might be a sad for you, is my model of being one of which is already woven into exteriorities,
Erik just made a
non-human, etc. And that our kind of natural state is animistic.
Erik would probably say this will be the last.
In nature, within getting communications from non-human agents, with their ultimate ontology doesn't really matter. And so that as we march towards humanism or go down the path of technological development, there's kind of like a gap between that. And when we can go back and taste that again, we'll do it not necessarily not that it's going to help. In fact, it probably makes things worse sometimes. But there's kind of like a call for that. And so that if we're right, and then look, you can draw connections between these mutations in media machines, and these explosions in fantasy or whatever.
Yeah.
It's partly because there's like a space opened up where like, wow, the novels really can be like another world, and then you're like, it's really working out, it's just a commodity, blah, 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 over time we get used to it. So there's kind of a space opened up within, or another way, I could say the same story is we have like unresolved dilemmas about this side of human consciousness. And so it's not just going to be pragmatic because they're not just human signs. That's, I think, the kind of thing. It's like one of the arguments in pharmaco AIs, it's like, yeah, it's all about human signs and human language, but it's taking place inside of a larger planetary and even cosmic regime of signifying. And that's why in that book, which is very intelligent, ayahuasca is really important because ayahuasca is a technique, and you can't just get the plant, you have to brew it and cook it over time. You need to know what you're doing. It's a technique that then boots up a interface in which it seems to some that you're actually engaging in relations with non-human entities. So the K.L. McDonald's is saying, we're kind of doing the same thing. It's like now it's like we're building an interface within which we can engage non-human agents that we have both a longing and a fear for. Whereas in a way, the way you'd answer your question to say, why are we doing all this crazy Gothic stuff? Is you say, well, no, we're just about human agents here. We're just trying to get better at being humans and just understand how humans do human stuff. And we don't really bother with that. It's like it's going to take its own thing. And I think both are operative in human culture, but the other one, however you frame the ontology, the other one is really significant and keeps just coming up and coming up and coming up. It helps explain how cultures intensify and become kind of take off and go transcendent or reproduce religion over and over and over and over again. Which we still see. Are we done with this yet? This crazy religious stuff? No, it just keeps happening in different kinds of ways. And I think there's some. That's what I would respond to that. But I think the point about media is really good, and I think seeing AI as another iteration of essentially writing. It's basically writing. And the other point I didn't mention that's always seems really important to me is like all the stuff it's doing has to do with like going into the language paradigm. You want the robot to pick up the bottle, turn it into a set of sentences that the thing can autofill, and there we go. It might actually be able to pick up the bottle. So that the fact that it's language again, and then it's writing again, and then for me, there's always something mysterious about writing. That's, I guess, where I would kind of locate. Maybe that's a fun thing to say. There's something, even though it's a pragmatic mark, it's a mark in a world of other non-human signifying regimes. And it's a mark that from the very beginning, there's an exteriority to it that we can't contain or control or entirely know. So that's why if you look at like the history of magic, you see a lot of their marks, it's writing, it's marks. The grimoire is powerful because it's a book of marks. And that magical dimension, anthropological sense, that magical dimension of writing continues to animate writing machines, particularly when they take off or disrupt society. All right.
Okay, I think that's a perfect point to end on.